The following episode contains explicit content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
During times of prayer, I would just be screaming, would the real Jesus please stand up? Because I was just so confused. I feel like I had 9 different representations of who Jesus was based on my life experience. And I was like, who's the real one?
That is the voice of Joey Papa, and he is my guest for this episode of the Nook Podcast. More about him in just a moment. My name is Stephen Murphy, and I am so honored to have you listening today. This is week 2 of this series titled Personal Jesus, No Cookie Cutter Faith, looking at stories from people who have dealt with some really dark times and have had their faith deeply challenged. Before our time together is done, I hope that you will check out all of the information in the show notes. There you will find my email address. I'd love to hear from you. Also, links to the Nook Facebook page, my social media feeds, and one that just says support the show, which is a safe and simple way for you to help the Nook financially. Now, about my guest today. Joey Papa has a story of great highs and lows, some pieces that may leave you astonished. I will warn you that some of the language is strong, and while it may ruffle some of your sensibilities, I believe that you will hear a story of deep honesty and evidence that our God is big enough to answer us in the midst of our darkest hour when we cry out with the only words that seem to make sense. I have said multiple times on this show that real faith is messy and that we do a watching world a terrible disservice when we portray walking with Jesus as perfection. We all stumble, fall, and fail. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, it says, I take pleasure in weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So settle in for this conversation with Joey Papa. Joey, I feel like I've caught just enough of your story through your podcast, through what you post on TikTok. But can you, for my listeners' sake, give me at least the kind of the view of early life for Joey? How you were brought up? What was family life like?
Yeah, I come from a family that my parents were married. I have 3 brothers. Was raised in the church. They converted from Catholicism to Protestantism. They kind of came into the charismatic Pentecostal church. And so that was when I was really young, about 3. It was around 9 years old is when I started to really desire God, I guess is the way to put it. And it was just really in my own personal life. It wasn't so much at church. It was just that I started talking to him while I was falling asleep, things along those lines. He just made himself really real to me. I always like to say I met God and learned about his character and his nature before I really learned about him from other people. So I think that's something that has always stuck with me throughout my life. And into my teenage years, I became a zealot. I was that teenager that was I had my Bible at high school with me, trying to evangelize. I was C at the pole, the whole 9. Was brought up in the very midst of purity culture and completely digested that, became a champion of that. So I was a virgin when I got married. And then in my 20s, things started getting a little confusing because a lot of what I was brought up in didn't seem like it was adding up. The love that people talked about was really absent from a lot of the people that I grew up with, as well as my own self. What I was emulating, I didn't realize what it was at the time, but looking back at it, what the confusion was coming from was I felt very judgmental. I felt very condemning, not only of other people, but of myself. It just did not feel like this is life and life abundantly. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I started to really start to grapple with a lot of different things during my college years, really. And then into my adult life, I experienced a lot of different unfortunate circumstances. We had a child that was born with medical complications. She passed away at 3.5 years old. And then shortly after that, my wife decided to leave. And then my son got cancer.
Oh,
So it's
wow.
been kind of like one thing after another. And I really think a lot of those traumatic experiences in our lives, they really shatter all the bullshit that we built. And they really just, what remains is what remains. You know what I mean? And so I did come to like the lowest point of my life, severe depression, suicidal, got hospitalized for that. And I just held on to Jesus. Like that was it. Like I had nothing. I didn't care about religion, doctrine, nothing. Like it was just like, I felt like I was back to my 9-year-old self. Like, I just need you. I just want to die. I don't want to be here. And, that's the type of intimacy I feel like I've always had with God. And throughout my life, doctrine and, the pressures of church culture just clouded that relationship more than really helped it.
Well, so then I'm curious with that. You're talking about, you make me think of Job. I'm assuming maybe I'm not the only one that's ever mentioned that, where it just feels like you're in a season of loss. Was there ever a point within those dark times where you just completely walked away, or was God always in there somewhere?
No, God was always in there somewhere, but not so much on my end. Like I never, throughout all the traumatic stuff that I've gone through, I've never been someone that has the disposition of like, I'm going to blame God. Like I've never really been angry at God per se. And that's not like something I tried to do. I think it's just because my perspective has always been God is good. He's kind, he's gracious. And all of this shitstorm that we experience in this life is because of this crazy world that we live in.
Yeah.
I guess the cheap Christian answer would be that it's because of the fall and like just how things are so dysfunctional and things are out of order and chaotic. But I mean, there was definitely, during those deepest, darkest moments, I didn't care anymore about anything. I didn't care about being a dad. I didn't care about my faith. I didn't care about anything. But the craziest thing for me, which is kind of where my podcast came from, was really in the midst of those moments where I didn't give a shit that I actually experienced the grace and the presence of God, probably to the most potent level that I have in my entire life. Like, when people say God is faithful, like I not only believe that, but I know that to be true because of my life experience. Like he has never left me. And there were moments where I was in a lot of pain and I made a lot of really bad decisions, acted out in ways that I wish I didn't. But even in those, I always tell people it was like I could feel the presence of God with me. And it was just like he was a patient father, like a companion, someone that was just standing by with lots of compassion, grace, and understanding. I never, ever felt condemned by him, ever. And that's my real lived experience. It's not because of doctrine or I'm trying to preach a sermon. It's literally like I based on the God I was taught, he should have been really pissed at me, but instead I was surprised, very surprised at his grace. And I wasn't even looking for it. That's the thing. It was not like I was trying to fit my experience into some theological construct. I don't know how much can I swear on here?
Sure. Have at it.
Okay. No, my life was fucked. Like I was just done. And he was there. He found me. And it was, I don't know, I've always related with David, like all of his laments and his ways of speaking to God. I feel like I've always had a relationship with God like that, where I've never been afraid to express my anger to him or to say, what the hell is going on? I don't understand, and I think a common prayer of mine, which is very unorthodox throughout my day, is when I'm going through stuff, I'm just like, fuck, God, help me, please. Like that is my genuine prayer, and I know a lot of Christians would be like, how can you say fuck to God? But like, it just shows, it reminds me of David, like the waters are up to my neck. Like I'm going to die here. What's going on? Where are you?
Is there a way to compare then what you found in the reality of those really dark times versus that God that you were so zealous for as a much younger person? Was it like two different versions of God, or did you just find him to be so much more real when you hit rock bottom?
I think in my earlier days, there was a mixture. There was a genuine dynamic I had with God, a relationship that ended up getting very confusing and twisted because of religion that was put on me. Religious practice, expectation, again, being raised in the charismatic church, like everything was a demon. There's just a lot of shame put on me and everyone I grew up with. Everything was a problem. You're always striving for some sense of rightness or righteousness that you never attain.
Well, there's always such a healthy dose of legalism in that world that it's like, well, we're not like the fundamentalists. So it somehow takes on its own character within that filter. And I say that as one who cut my teeth on the Pentecostal side as well.
Yes. Oh, it very much so. And the church I was raised in was Assemblies of God, but the pastors that led it were more from the old school Pentecost. So the wife didn't wear makeup. She always wore dresses. So there was already this very legalistic ideology that was incorporated. Not every AG church is like that, but the one I grew up in was. And then there were these women who were all about the new charismatic movements, whether it be in Toronto or Pensacola, all those. So there was this really odd mishmash of old school Pentecost with new ideas that were emerging in the charismatic world. So yeah, I think my zeal and my passion was because I genuinely loved God, but the way that it was taught to me and demonstrated, the way that what I thought to be a good Christian was, or to please God, was to do these things, act this way, believe these beliefs. And that's why it started to all fall apart in my 20s when I went to college, because I met people who were from very different denominational upbringings, and they just eluded peace and kindness and goodness and all these things. And I was so confused. I was like, why is this not in my life? I'm so dedicated and passionate for the things of God, but yet I feel so condemning and condemned myself. It just baffled me. And that's when I really started to be like, okay, something is not 100% here. Something's not adding up for me.
Was there a time then where you started to think that maybe wrong is the wrong word, but did you feel like maybe I didn't get the whole picture as a youth? When you talk about something like that, where you're bumping into people who really seem to have a whole new gear that you hadn't experienced before.
Yeah, that was right around the time when Eminem came out with this song with the real Slim Shady, Please Stand Up. And I remember, this is so cheesy, but I remember during times of prayer, I would just be screaming with the real Jesus, please stand up, because I was just so confused. I feel like I had 9 different representations of who Jesus was based on my life experience. And I was like, who's the real one? There's one that is always judgmental and condemning and hard on people and expects me to live this high righteous life. Then there's another one who's just the grace, peace, Jesus. It's all these different representations, because the school I went to was a charismatic school, but it was so diverse in denominational affiliations, that people that came there. So it really was multi-denominational. So I was being introduced to all these different flavors and streams of Christianity that I hadn't experienced before. And in my upbringing, it was taught to me, and I even believed it, people who were not Pentecostal or charismatic, they don't have the fullness. It was again, this it was tainted with this judgment and we have something more that other people don't have. Very pious, arrogant, us and them type mentality. And that started to fall apart as well, because I know that that's not Jesus. Because as I read the Gospels, I was I just don't see that in his life or his teachings or anything. So that's what I did to really help myself, in a sense, was I just started to really read the Gospels and think about who Jesus was, why he did what he did, how he approached people, how he moved through the world. And that's what I really started to grab onto more than anything. It took years and years and years for a lot of the religiosity to really begin to start to fall off or dissipate in my life. And then those traumatic experiences in my adult life kind of obliterated anything that was being held up by sticks as opposed to something that was solid.
Right. Was there any moment then when you had been through that brutally dark time with your marriage, with the issues that went on in your children. What did it finally look like turning the corner? If it did actually turn a corner?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, a lot of people, I'll say this, a lot of people think that I'm really like that even my podcast is about deconstruction and all that, but I feel like my entire faith has been such an evolutionary process. Like I have deconstructed on micro levels and reconstructed since I was a teenager, like until now I'm 43. So it's been throughout my life that I feel like there's certain things that have stood out to me that have been like, I don't know about that. And I just think deconstruction in general is a part of being human. Like we do it with our way of approaching parenting or the way that we think about eating and exercise. Like we're always adjusting our belief systems, regardless if it's religious or not.
Yeah.
But I would say that I think, again, I keep going. When I got hospitalized for suicide and after that, I just didn't give a shit anymore. Like all of the expectations that I think I put on myself that maybe started with other people's expectations of me, I just didn't care anymore. And I didn't even care about if I got it right in the sense of like my doctrine, because that was something that was nailed in my head throughout my entire life, even as an adult, in my 30s and, late 30s even. Like, it's so important to have the right doctrine and da-da-da. And I was always like, I don't know about that. Like there's 30,000 different denominations. Like nobody has it quote unquote right. Like we all have it wrong in some way. Like, and then when you bring it back to the teachings of Jesus, it's like to love God and love people. That's what it all hinges on. Nothing else really matters. Like whether you believe in this version of whatever, doctrine you want to insert there. So, I think that at those lowest points, I just was so convinced of God's goodness and his grace. That was a big turning point for me. I didn't care about anything anymore. I just knew that he was good and that he loved me, and that our biggest failures are just an incredible opportunity for us to experience his goodness in a much deeper way. So I think at that point, I think I just threw everything off. Like I just, I didn't care anymore if people were like, oh, you sound like a progressive Christian, or you sound like you're leaving your faith and all that. I was just like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I don't care. Like none of this matters to me anymore. What cares is like life. Like I need to live and I need to be alive and I need to be authentic. That was the biggest thing, is that I just felt like the church taught me to be dishonest. Like nobody ever taught that from a pulpit. Nobody ever said it, but in all the actions, like 7 or 8 pastors in the church I grew up in were all fired because I had affairs. Like, it's like there was such a lack of honesty, like of authenticity. And so now I'm just on this mission to be honest, because I believe God meets us in honesty. The Bible itself is so honest. It's not like sugarcoating anything. Like people's, mess ups and the way that they were screwed up is just so plain as day. But somehow the modern church has really implemented a pressure to conform to some expectation, or that life is supposed to look a certain way if you're a Christian, quote unquote.
Well, okay, you look at a statement like you just made, and on one hand, it can sound like you are bitter, aloof, to say that I just don't care anymore. But at the same time, I hear a lot of conviction in that is just like everything else has been stripped away, and you're at that bedrock moment that it's Jesus plus nothing. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. And I feel the most resolved and at peace with my faith that I ever have in my life. It's easy for me to talk to people about my faith, whether they're believers or not. Because it's so real to me now. You know what I mean? It's not something that's been passed down or something that I assimilated into. The funny thing is, I was hurt by the church, but I don't feel like I'm living from a place of hurt. Like I don't feel hurt now. And even my hope in my podcast is that other people who have been hurt can hear some of the stories of people. And really the whole point is to elevate the truth of who Jesus is and the reality of him in our daily life, and how he is there to rescue us, comfort us, convict us. All of those things are the role that he plays in our life. But I do think that, and also I guess to answer your question, I've also said on my podcast that I would consider myself a failed Christian, the way that I see Jesus as a failed Jew. Like Jesus was a rebel to the Jewish religion, and he was very subservient. He broke the law consistently. He went against their practices, their traditions, everything. And he wasn't bitter, obviously.
Right.
He just was impassioned for people and the reality of relationship with God. And, I really think people need to reread the Gospels and see it through the lens of Jesus and sinners, like on one side, and then Jesus versus the religious on the other side. Because so many of the parables that we even use, like so many parables even that are about hell, were directed at the Pharisees.
Right.
You never hear Jesus telling a sinner, you're going to go to hell if you don't change your life. Like it's always directed towards the religious. And so I do see that as being something consistent in my life, in the sense of like wanting to follow who he is. And I think that how Judaism and what Judaism represented back in Jesus's day is unfortunately what the Christian religion has become in our day. And I do think there needs to be reformation. I think there does need to be some people who are subservient in a righteous way, not in a way of like, we want to burn the thing to the ground, but like really making known the reality of who God is. Because what Judaism was doing in the day of Jesus was it was blocking people from the reality of God and relationship with the Father. And that's what really pissed Jesus off the most. He was very vocal towards them. And then of course, throwing over the tables in the temple. And, he was very upset, to say the least, about the way that they were creating all of these rules, all of these doctrines, all of these traditions that people were required to do in order to be good enough for God. And I think that really bothered Jesus because it was keeping people from him. And I think the same thing happens today in religious environments, church culture. It becomes so much about the wrong things. People focus on one specific doctrine over, they're going to overemphasize, or there's, manipulation, fear tactics, abuse, toxicity, and all those things. Like they need to be addressed. And I'm not afraid to address them.
Okay. Well, if I can take you back then just to some of those darkest days, I'm really curious, even like you've mentioned a couple of times, you're in a hospital with suicidal ideation. What were your conversations like with God in those moments of what I assume were just dark, desperate, unhinged times? Were you having conversations with God, or I don't know, maybe it's just better to say what were your days like when that was what you were facing?
Well, my whole objective and all of my energy at that time was to survive that day. Like I was severely suicidal. I was tempted to kill myself. It wasn't, like when people hear about suicide, they think like someone's just thinking, oh, I would like to kill myself, or, they just get to a desperate place. But it was the same way, like if you're tempted to cheat on your wife or to look at porn or to get drunk every night or whatever, the desire to kill myself was immense. It was like I was salivating for it. Like I wanted to die more than I wanted to live. And so my main objective was to get through the day. And one of my biggest spiritual inspirations is Mother Teresa. And I remember reading an article from her years ago when someone interviewed her and basically asked her, okay, when you pray to God, what do you say? And she said, I listen. And then he was a little confused by that. And so he said, well, what does he say to you? And she says, I listen. And in those most darkest moments, that's what it was. The communication wasn't coming out of my verbal, I wasn't verbalizing, I wasn't talking. My heart was bleeding in pain and agony. And I was sharing that moment with him, and he was sharing his heart with me in that moment. So it was beyond words. It was beyond the traditional idea of prayer.
Right.
But I was desperate, very desperate because even though everything in me wanted to die, logically I didn't, because I have 4 kids and, I didn't want to leave them. But I just felt I was in so much pain that I just could not think about living another day or year or whatever. So that's really what I would say is like my prayer just became part of my my bleeding heart, my aching, my brokenness.
Well, and don't you think that if more of us were honest with ourselves, that while we may not be in the same depths that you were, any one of us on any given day is facing our own garbage or situational darkness. Are we better off acknowledging those times and just basically falling on our faces in front of God to say, my efforts to try to fix this are completely useless? And it's I don't know, to me, it's almost comical when I feel like, all right, I've got the plan to figure this out, and I'll check back with you in a little bit. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm hoping you can address some of that honesty that I wish more of modern claimingly, is that a word? People who claim faith in the right now. What would we be like if we could get a better handle on that truth, on that honesty?
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts with that. One is take it back to David and his laments. Like, God is real. And if he's real, he meets us in reality. He doesn't meet us in fantasy or a delusion or, like when we're trying to live in denial. So like, I think God sometimes will enter into our delusion to bring us back into reality, but like honesty is really where it's at. And I think of, the only time we hear Jesus giving an instruction to do anything, to remember him by, is through communion, which is a representation of his suffering.
Yes.
And so for me, communion is very sacred in the sense of it is our common union. The thing that Jesus and I can relate on, and you and I can relate on, is our suffering. That's where we can meet in our pain. And there is comfort and understanding and compassion there. And I've always had a really deep understanding of that ever since I was young, because I was suicidal when I was a teenager as well, like early teenage years, 12, 13. And that's where I met God, was in the midst of those horrendous thoughts, feelings, and whatever. So I've always known God in the pain and in the suffering, but it didn't hit me till later in life that, like, when Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, that he never said that about anything else. Like, he made a point for us to remember his suffering because that's where we meet. Like, our common union is our suffering. And I found that in general, like, that's just how humans, that's how we connect. Like, when I meet someone and if I'm honest with them or they're honest with me and I feel their pain or see their pain or vice versa, it doesn't matter the differences of religion or of walk of life or of culture. Like, our hearts just have kind of a automatic knee-jerk reaction to open up. Like, we see someone in need, we see someone in pain, and we connect on a deep level, right, whether we know that person or not. And so I think that what the majority of the American church has taught, unfortunately, is to be dishonest, is to live in denial, with a lot of different stuff and issues. And I think that's why we see so many breakdowns and scandals and, all that craziness, is just because people are not living honestly, and people really don't like honesty. That's the truth. It's like, we don't, I mean, like, I would say in religious settings, we don't like honesty, you know?
We hide behind our masks.
Yeah. If your pastor stood up and was honest about his struggles with his sexuality or with porn or with whatever it is, like, that's just not going to happen in most churches. But it's happening.
Right.
It's happening. You know what I mean? Like, it's happening. And we don't realize it until it does come out in some scandal or whatever it is. And then, unfortunately, the damage is done. And it hurts the faith. It hurts, the people in that church community. And it's unfortunate. But honesty, and to the point of putting yourself in a painful position, I believe God honors that, and he meets us in that.
Yeah. Well, then I really do want to find out, what was the culmination of so many of these things that had you arrive at, all right, I'm going to do a podcast about this, and I'm going to have these open, honest conversations with people. Can you give me an idea? What was the sparks that said, all right, this is the way I'm going to choose to start to share my story and that of others in similar situations.
All right. Well, here's the honesty. So I was so after my wife left me, we moved to Florida. She moved to Florida first, and then I moved down there and did not want to move down there because I had a great community in Charleston, South Carolina, where I was living at the time. But I moved down there, and moving down there, I was very lonely. I did find a church that I felt at home at, but just really had a hard time making deep connections. Going through the pain of divorce. My son is still going through cancer treatment and all of that. My kids are adjusting to split up parents. They're adjusting to their brother having cancer. They're adjusting to moving to a new location. So there's just a lot going on in me, a lot of loneliness, pain, loss, devastation, all that stuff. And like I had mentioned before, I was brought up in purity culture, virgin when I got married. I was faithful to my wife. She's the only person I'd ever been with. But since I was young, I always knew I was bisexual. So I came out to my parents when I was 14, told them, my youth pastor. That did not go well. It was very damaging for me because at that time, the whole LGBTQ stuff wasn't even on the radar culturally, nor was it definitely not on the radar in the church world. So I was just coming to them because I was just being honest. Like I wasn't trying to announce something or try to make a proclamation. But they didn't know what to do with that. So they responded in the way that they did. You know, my mom became charismatic lady and started casting the devil out of me. And my youth pastor didn't know what to do. My dad was disinterested and fell asleep. So very painful. So fast forward to Florida, lonely, in a lot of pain. And I was just like, fuck it. I'm going to try this out. So I got on Grindr. I hooked up with a bunch of dudes for 6 weeks. And during that time, my mental health went to I was like majorly depressed, feeling so anxious. And throughout all of that, that is when I experienced tremendous grace from God. Now, regardless of what people believe about LGBTQ stuff or whatever, that doesn't matter. It's just that I was going against my own conscience in the sense of like the way I was going about. Yeah, God, I just don't think it's a healthy thing to sleep around with people that are strangers you don't know. It's very dangerous and whatever. But that was my big fuck you to life, basically. That was my rebellion of, I don't really give a shit anymore. I'm doing whatever I want to do. I'm in pain, and this is going to answer questions for me that I've always wanted to know. And so finally, after 6 weeks, I was like, okay, I need to stop this. I was in therapy at the time. My therapist agreed, like, you just need to knock this off because this is not doing you well. And so I did. And when I did, the amount of grace that I experienced from God was crazy. I just bawled my eyes out for hours in the privacy of my home. There was no worship music. There was no pastor. There was no altar call. It's just like, it was such a beautiful moment. And I was driving in my car after that. And I was like, damn, I am such a fucked up Christian. I am such a failed Christian. I have failed at everything that was taught to me that I should be. Like I'm divorced. I just fucked around with a bunch of dudes. You know, I've had financial difficulties. I've been hospitalized for suicide. I'm on antidepressants. Like I am so failed to the nth degree. Yeah. And when I said that out of my mouth, it was like, oh, there's something there. Like, I think a lot of other people feel this way. And to me, that's good news, is that when you can find out that you have failed at everything and God's goodness, his grace, his mercy is just as present as it was when you were being the good Christian boy at 16, you know? So that was the breaking point for me. And that's what gave me the idea for the podcast. And really my heart behind the podcast is not to church bash. Like that's not my desire. My heart is to give people an opportunity to tell their story, to be truthful and honest about it. And if church hurt is a part of that, then it is. That's just part of their story. But really the point of it is to demonstrate God's goodness through our failures, like for people to have the opportunity to speak freely about how they've failed and found God's grace. And so like the tagline for the show is conversations with messed up people working out their faith. So I say on my trailer, it's not meant for the son who stayed home in the father's house. The podcast is meant for the prodigal who left and squandered everything. So it's not meant for everyone. And I know that, and I'm not trying to get everyone to listen to it. It is meant for those who can identify with the idea of squandering their inheritance and finding a loving Father with open arms that throws a banquet when we return.
Do you hear from people? I mean, I can't help but wonder what kind of feedback are you getting, since you are diving into some pretty deep topics that we've already addressed it. Most people just aren't that crazy in being very honest about. Do you find that you're basically giving people that place to land and say, okay, I can feel safe here to talk about my failures?
Yeah, majority of the listenership are people who are either deconstructing like that whole camp, or have a lot of church hurt, a lot of people who are confused. I call us the displaced, where we don't really identify any longer with like the evangelical American Christian way, or culture, I should say, but we desperately love Jesus and we don't know where we fit. And a lot of them also don't fit in the deconstruction camp. There's some of them that do, but others like myself, I don't, and not because I have anything against it. I just have never been a part of that. It's not like I had a moment where I was like, screw my faith, I'm going to pull it all apart and figure it out. It's just the evolution and progress of my life. And then I do have some that, do not like the podcast and that they don't listen to it. But again, I don't find any, and it's kind of more rare, to be honest with you, because I think even if you listen to the trailer, you're going to get turned off if it's not for you. You know what I mean? Because it's illicit and, we swear and we're very honest. And so, but yeah, I've gotten a lot of incredible feedback from people who just feel like a sense of relief, like a sense of home. And yeah, I think that's really what I'm doing it for, is I want people to have a place where we can talk about the things of God and the reality of God and his grace without feeling the pressure to conform to, Christian culture, if you would.
Where do you see that show going? Obviously they always tell you to find your niche. It sounds like you have definitely niched down, maybe like any other podcast host that I've ever spoken with. But where do you see it going with regard to the type of person that this is going to resonate with?
Yeah, my hope is to create community, even if it's an online community, where people can continue to dialogue and connect. I've thrown around the idea of creating some Zoom groups, where people can join in around a specific subject. The two I have in mind are one on recovering from spiritual abuse, because I find that's a very common denominator among my listenership. And then the other one would be around more or less going through a book. I'm a big fan of Shane Claiborne, who I just had on. So going through his book, The Red Letter Revolution, because if I can identify with anything that resonates with me more, or I should say this, the thing that resonates with me the most is his movement, like the way he sees Jesus, the way that he's convicted about taking care of those who are powerless or in need. That's the heartbeat that I have. So I'm very much aligned with them. So if I had to say, I've never gone up there, I plan on going up there, but so point being is that I'm probably going to do another group that focuses going through that book. But again, just giving people the space to be able to connect and not feel so alone. Because that's the thing, is that when you leave the institutionalized, American machine that we call church, it's very, very lonely. And a lot of people do fall off and they don't want anything to do with it anymore. And those people are welcome as well to my podcast, and welcome into these groups or whatever. I did an episode on a friend of mine that was a phenomenal, like looked up to type person, Christian, and now he's a agnostic atheist. And so I just think I've recently had a revelation of free will, and I'm like, listen, God allows us to do whatever the hell we want to do, whatever we want to do, whether we want to take someone's life or we want to go sleep around or we want to get drunk every night, like shoot up heroin. He's not stopping us. We can do it. Why? Because he honors our free will. He honors our choice. Now, there's consequences with that. I'm not saying that, but somehow the church has forgotten about free will. Like we stand in judgment of other people, but they can choose whatever they want to choose. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean I have to break relationship or friendship with them. Like, I can honor where they're at. And I actually think that is the demonstration of the kingdom of heaven coming to earth, is to remain with someone regardless of what their belief is, what they're going through, what they're choosing to do, to be a consistent representation of grace, of acceptance, of love. To me is Jesus being demonstrated.
Do you find that your episodes turn out to be a bit therapeutic for you?
Oh, absolutely. The whole thing is cathartic. I say on my podcast, these are conversations I've been having with myself for 40 years. Now I'm finally able to have them with other people. So yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely one area that was a bit unexpected for me, especially in talking to folks. The tagline of my show is real faith in real time. Because in the last, 5-6 years for me, so much of it has just come down to what we spoke about just before we started this conversation, and that I feel like I got to the end of something and there just wasn't a whole lot of substance there. And that can feel a little bit, it's like I'm not anchored anymore. But I also knew deep down inside of me that there has to be more to this. And I'm not just going to go numb and sleepwalk through the rest of my life. There's a part of me that feels very remiss that I'm in my mid-50s and just finding the real hard truth of what we do find in Jesus' words, what we do find all through the Bible. And yet I have claimed to walk this thing since I was 19. I've wasted a whole lot of time, and I just don't want to be there anymore. So that real faith means that you've survived something, and the real time means that we have to walk this thing out day by day. There's no magic pill. There's no quick 3-step plan that means, in a short amount of time that you go from I once was blind, but now I see. Each one of us is walking this out as best we can, with, even based on what you just said, how much we will subject ourselves to saying, God, I want you in the middle of this, because I know I'm a whole lot better with you than I am without.
Truthfully, at the end of the day, I have some friends that are a little skeptical of me at sometimes, but I can genuinely say, like, I know Jesus is my salvation. Like, he is my salvation. That's undeniable to me. I would take a bullet for him, and I don't say that lightly. Like, I am convinced of who he is and the reality of who he is. And to me, that's it. That's enough. I don't need anything else. Like, I am convinced no matter what. Like, I've had every opportunity to abandon my faith, to leave him, to do all that jazz. And it's just not in me, because I have seen his faithfulness in my life so many times and so real to me that, like, I'm in love with him. Like, that's it. I am genuinely in love with God. I love him more than anything in this world, and that's it. I don't care. Nothing else matters to me.
Yeah. Well, something you just said there makes me curious. If you had to put yourself in the place of a friend, maybe even a family member that is very close to you, what do you think their assessment of Joey is right now? If you said, if you asked somebody, hey, what do you think about Joey? What's your assessment of who he is? What do you think they would be likely to say?
I think some people think that because of the pain that I've experienced, that's why I am where I am now. And that is true to a degree, but I mean in the way of, like, there's grace for me because I've been through a lot. So a lot of people just will continue to walk with me because of compassion or understanding. And then there's others who are, like, completely on board and 100% aligned and, like, my biggest fans, you know what I mean? So I think those are the two camps of people who are close to me end up landing in. I know my parents, they listen to every podcast I put out. I know they don't agree with everything. And so, but they genuinely support me and love me. And I think they probably fall into that camp of, like, understanding I've been through a lot and extend grace for, some of the things that maybe they don't agree with.
Right. I always like to leave a little room at the end. Is there anything that you thought we would talk about but didn't, or maybe something else that has just come to mind through our conversation? I just call this open mic time, that if there's anything else you want to talk about, time is yours.
I mean, honestly, the only thing that I would say that I really want to make clear is there's a huge invitation and so much freedom into being honest, and honesty really starts with yourself. I think a lot of times when people think about, oh, you need to be honest, we think about telling our honesty to other people, but most of us are living in denial with ourselves. I am still to this day, and you are, and everyone else is, on little levels to big levels. And a lot of us just aren't aware of those things, but it's really just getting clear. And, we all learn coping mechanisms and ways to deny things that we don't like about ourselves, things that we think God doesn't like about us or whatever. But there is grace in honesty. There is grace in being truthful about what you're feeling, what you're going through, your desires, things you've done, whatever it is. And so I just would invite people to start there. One little step. And that's again, it's about getting honest with yourself first, and or God first, and then with other people. There's such a reward on the other side of it. There's so much freedom. There's such a relief that comes from being honest that is so worth the nervousness and the intimidation of wanting to get honest at first. But it's so worth it.
This conversation left me convicted, thinking about all the times that I have been less than honest when I approach God about anything, as if He doesn't already know what I'm in the middle of. My lack of honesty is only going to hinder me. Psalm 51:17 says that God will never despise a broken spirit and a contrite heart. When we are the prodigal, He waits and watches for us to return home. If you or someone you know would like to check out Joey's podcast, The Failed Christian, I have a link in the show notes. Coming up next week, a conversation with filmmaker Michael Ray Lewis, who spent most of his life as an atheist. So, what happens when you die? Any idea what you would have said?
I would have said that we would just die and that was it. We would cease to exist. I would basically say that once I die, I think of it as similar to when I'm asleep, because when I'm asleep and my brain isn't dreaming, then it's as though you sleep and instantly wake up. There's this state of just nothingness. And so I would just assume that when we die, we die.
Through his story, we explore the doubts and questions that many of us have on our own spiritual journeys, and how it's possible to overcome them and find a deeper understanding of who God is.
This is about a 3-year process of me going through books and videos and just studying and deeper into it. And I remember at the end of it, I was still trying to push against it. I didn't want to believe it.
Thank you so much for listening today, and I will catch you here next time in the Nook.
The Nook Podcast is a production of Sozo Digital Media.